I'm Scott Loveridge with the National Agricultural and Rural Development Policy Center, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today we have Adam Reimer, who's a postdoctoral research fellow with the center, presenting on this title that you see before you. Adam has his PhD from Purdue University and has been looking at this question for quite a little while. So I'll turn it over to you, Adam.
All right, thank you, Scott, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm hoping to maybe talk a little bit about changes to the conservation programs in the upcoming Farm Bill, should we ever get one, I suppose. Talk a little bit about how the changes might impact farmer participation. So, to give a little bit of an outline about where we're going today, I thought I'd start off by kind of defining agri-environmental policy problems and the kinds of tools that currently exist to address those problems. I'm going to talk a little bit about farmer participation and what kind of determines who's participating and why. And then, like I said in the introduction, kind of talking a little bit about the changes to the upcoming Farm Bill and how that might impact participation. So to start out with, we'll talk a little bit about the kinds of policy problems that we're talking about. Despite many of the great things that agriculture does, there are environmental problems that are associated with agricultural production. These would include things like water pollution, sediment, nutrient, pesticide loading to waterways, water use. Agriculture in the U.S. represents about 80% of the freshwater consumptive use, so it's a very large draw of available water. Degradation and loss of wildlife habitat. Obviously, as land is being used for agricultural production, that limits its ability to be used as wildlife habitat. Soil loss and degradation, air pollution, including things like particulate matter, dust, and greenhouse gas emissions as well. One of the keys to talking about environmental policy issues is that you always have to balance environmental protection with agricultural production. Clearly, the goal of environmental policy is not to overly constrain or shut down agricultural production, but simply to find an appropriate balance between the environment and farming. One of the ways we can kind of look at environmental problems would be to sort of compare the difference between externalities and kind of competing use problems. So competing use really talks about the trade-offs between allocating resources between agriculture and other uses. So again, wildlife habitat would be a key example of this. Also, water use. Obviously, if water is being used in agricultural production, it's not available to be used for other reasons. We can also talk about externalities. So these would be sort of negative results from economic activity like agricultural production. So these would be sort of unintended consequences such as water and air pollution, climate change impacts to some extent. Now, one of the things I should say about externalities is they can be good or bad. So when we talk about climate change, which I won't talk about that much today because the policy tools don't really address climate change fully at this point, but there is some potential for agriculture to have positive externalities in sort of carbon capture and retention. One of the things we look at when we talk about policy tools is that the number of policy tools used should match up with the number of policy problems being addressed. So as the previous slide sort of alluded to, there are differences in the kinds of environmental problems we're trying to deal with. And so we might need more than just one policy tool to address those problems. When we talk about policy tools, we sort of typically talk about a dichotomy between incentives or carrots and regulatory mechanisms or sticks. So under incentives, we have things like education, financial incentives or subsidies. That would include things like cost share. We could pay for performance, where we set a particular goal and then pay for particular outcomes. We can also have collective incentives, where we're not just focusing on individuals, but we sort of leave it to a community or group level, and that's sort of a pay for performance on a group level. Under regulatory mechanisms, we can have things like taxes, technological standards where we require individual economic actors to employ certain technologies. That's commonly used in what we call point source pollution problems, where we require, say, factories to include some sort of technology that deals with pollution. We could also have cap and trade strategy, where we set some limit and then allow kind of a market mechanism to allocate those different kind of pollution limits among the actors in that program. Now, Scott, if you could activate the next poll, I wanted to get a sense of what people know about existing conservation programs. So just kind of indicate which of these programs you're familiar with as I go forward. So when we talk about U.S. Agricultural environmental policy, we're really talking about voluntary mechanisms. Traditionally, we've really relied on incentives, particularly these first two, education, which we typically refer to as outreach, and subsidies, either cost share or some sort of rental payment agreement, which I'll go into in a little more depth. Now, under these sort of two categories, we typically we have a number of different programs that exist, and it's sort of referred to as the portfolio of conservation programs. And it looks like people are fairly familiar with some of these, particularly the Conservation Reserve Program, which doesn't surprise me. So when we talk about conservation programs, we typically group them into two categories. We have land retirement or easement programs. And the goal of these programs is to remove agricultural land from production and place it in some sort of conservation cover that would provide some sort of environmental benefit. The Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, is the oldest and sort of most well established of these programs. So again, not surprising that most people have heard of it. We also have working lands programs. The idea behind these programs is that they're providing some sort of incentive to farmers to modify current production systems by undertaking some sort of conservation practice. So the idea there is that we are sort of incentivizing protecting environmental quality on active agricultural land. The two programs that are typically grouped under those are the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is the largest working lands program in the U.S., and the Conservation Stewardship Program. The main difference between those two is that the EQIP primarily provides cost share funding for individual practices. The Conservation Stewardship Program is really designed to reward and incentivize farmers to undertake sort of whole farm conservation measures. So that's sort of a more robust version of a working lands program. Scott, I think you can probably put that poll to the side now. There's also a conservation technical assistance program that sort of undergirds the entire system. So that's really getting at that education tool. The idea there is that pays for staffing and for outreach mechanisms that try to raise awareness of programs and conservation measures among farmers. In addition to the programs, we also have a conservation compliance program or measure that's in place. The idea there is it's a little more, I guess, towards the regulatory side. So we're adding requirements, some basic environmental protections that are required for farmers to participate in other farm programs, particularly commodity programs. So in order for farmers to receive their direct payments, they have to meet some basic requirements, one of which is known as the sodbuster rule, and that requires farmers to have management plans for highly erodible lands that they farm. There's also the swamp buster rule, which protects wetlands from being torn up and put into agricultural production. So within the larger system of programs, each program sort of has a slightly different target talking about the two biggest programs, the CRP traditionally focuses on soil health and water quality. So it's really targeting surface erosion and water quality impacts from surface runoff. So the idea again is that farmers are removing land from production, placing it in a conservation cover, which then protects that land from negative impacts. It also addresses some sort of competing use problems, particularly wildlife habitat. So again, these areas of land are pulled out of production for a period of time and provide potentially high quality habitat for birds and mammals and things like that. EQIP focuses on a wider range of environmental problems. There are a number of different conservation practices that are eligible under the program, and those would address a wide range of things, including soil, water quality and water quantity, wildlife habitat, also manure management for livestock operations, and invasive species. The programs have changed over time. This graphic is from the USDA Economic Research Service, and this shows some of the changes over time. I think the major things to point out here are 1985 was when the CRP was created, and so we see a pretty sharp rise in the amount of money going into those land retirement programs at that time. 1996, we had continued problems from agricultural production. Water pollution in particular was becoming a big concern. So a new program was created, EQIP, which was sort of piloted in 1996, and then in 2002 funding increased. So we see here that since 2002 the primary growth in conservation funding has been to working lands programs, particularly CRP and the Conservation Stewardship Program. Okay. To move on, I'm going to talk a little bit now about determinants of program participation. So as I said, most of the conservation policy tools that we use in this country are incentive-based, and they're voluntary. We don't really use regulatory mechanisms. So it's important that we have active participation by farmers in order to achieve program goals. So there's been a wealth of research over the last few decades about why farmers participate, about who's participating. So we can talk about some of the determinants of program participation. So we talk about the program payment level, the amount of incentive offered to farmers. There are also farm level factors, farmer factors, and community factors. And I'm going to go through each one of these and talk a little more specifically about what each one entails. So program payments are obviously important when we're talking about financial incentives. Research shows that the payments need to be able to kind of largely cover the expected direct cost of adoption. So these practices require some sort of financial investment on the part of the farmer. So, excuse me. So the payments need to be able to cover at least a portion of that. They don't necessarily need to cover everything, but at least a portion of that cost. In addition, payments need to cover a portion of the expected lost revenue. So this is sort of the opportunity cost of participation in a program. The other thing is farmers require some sort of uncertainty or risk premium to participate. Anytime you have a modification to a farming system, it carries with it some sort of risk. And it's been shown that farmers need to be sort of compensated for that to participate. The other thing that social science research really shows is that farms are kind of at their core, many farms at least, are economic enterprises. So program payments are important to the bottom line and important to whether a farmer makes a decision to participate or not. But farmers themselves are not solely motivated by economic incentives. There are other things at play. We can talk about some of those here under farm factors. So different kinds of farms have different kind of financial constraints or incentives, and those can impact whether they participate or not. So we can talk about farm size. The incentives facing a 100-acre farm are quite different from those facing a 5,000-acre farm. Farm tenure. This is particularly important when you're talking about ownership patterns, whether the farmer owns the land that they're farming or whether they're just renting. That can have a large impact on participation decisions. And production system and farm type matter quite a bit as well. There are a number of ways we can look at differences in production systems, such as livestock versus crops, commodity crops versus specialty crops, conventional versus organic, and commercial versus hobby farm. I will talk about some of those last ones here in a few minutes. We also have farmer factors, so who the farmer is matters. Age has some impact, both in terms of their sort of access to information, their comfortability with technology, but also where that farmer is at in their kind of farm planning. So, the constraints on a beginning farmer are quite different than the concerns of, say, a farmer who's 5 years away from retiring. Under that, we also can have differences in succession planning. So farmers who are expecting to pass their land on to a family member might react differently to programs than a farmer who is not. Education has been shown to influence participation patterns. Additionally, values, beliefs, and attitudes play a huge role in conservation decisions. And we can talk about things like differing attitudes towards environmental protection. So these would be things like this sort of typical conservation-oriented farmers who really are interested in environmental protection. Maybe they're interested in wildlife habitat and they're maybe more inclined to participate in a conservation program. Views towards the environment or towards government are also quite important. You can have farmers who might be very interested in conservation in general, but might be disinclined to participate in a government program. Views towards farming as well play a difference. So this would be sort of differences in kind of what you might call the goals of the farm. In addition, we also have community factors, so factors outside of just the individual farm that might impact how a farmer perceives a program. We could refer to this as the information environment to some extent. So how much information is in the community, what the composition of social networks are, how much people talk about conservation programs. Tied with that is sort of the outreach history. So how actively conservation programs or conservation practices have been promoted in a particular area. Individual and community contact with conservation professionals has been shown to be quite important in how farmers perceive programs. We also have what you might call the neighbor effect. So these are social norms in an area that might promote or inhibit participation by people. You can see areas where there's sort of a negative reaction to government programs, and that might get in the way of an individual decision to participate or not. So when we look at those types of factors and how they kind of interact with the two kind of themes of our conservation programs. So we look at land retirement programs. These programs are older, they're more established. So CRP has been around since 1985. It is potentially easier to understand. While there are different practices under CRP that you can participate in, the program structure is largely the same. You sign up for the program, you have a fixed contract, you remove some area of land from production. It's a relatively straightforward program. CRP in particular has been shown to have high familiarity. Farmers across the country tend to be very familiar with it. So for instance, in the Iowa Farm Poll a few years ago, they found, which is a poll of farmers across the state of Iowa, they found something like 96% familiarity with CRP. It wasn't nearly as high for any other program. So CRP is sort of the big program that everybody knows. There's also some evidence that land retirement programs are better for smaller farms and for transitional farms. So people who are maybe older and transitioning out of farming, these land retirement programs are quite attractive. And we'll see that here in a few minutes. I have some national data. Working lands programs are a little bit different. So these are focused primarily on production modifications. Many of these practices have production benefits, so we might be talking about something like no-till systems, which have measurable soil benefits. They might have very positive impacts on production. So there's kind of an additional, beyond just the cost share payment, there's actually an incentive for farmers to want to do that for production reasons outside, not just for environmental reasons. Working lands programs tend to require a lot of management effort and time. We're talking about maybe more substantial changes to production systems. Moving to a no-till system from a conventional tillage system, it might require extra equipment. It certainly takes more time and planning, particularly at the beginning. The programs themselves are also more complicated, I would say, than CRP. So there's a whole suite of different practices that you can implement, and so the amount of time just to participate in the program is more significant for working lands programs. I think what this does is it leads to lower awareness among farmers, particularly among all kinds of farmers. There's also some evidence showing that programs like EQIP are not really targeted at all farms effectively, that there are certain kinds of production-oriented farms that are more oriented towards these programs, and other farmers just aren't really familiar with them. The high management time and effort really results in what we might call higher transaction costs, so that the cost of participating in the first place is just higher. The other thing is that the EQIP program has a specific livestock focus that CRP does not, which obviously impacts the kinds of farms that are more likely to participate. We also have differences in the types of farms across the country. Farms are not a monolith, so we have substantial variation in the types of farming operations we see over the landscape. So this is, again, USDA ERS data on different kinds of farms. So they have a categorization system here. So these would go from kind of the smallest farms up here to the larger farms. And we see when we look at the percentage of U.S. farms in each category, it's quite skewed towards these smaller farms. Something like 70% of farmers are these what you would call small family farms. In terms of value of production, however, most of the value is produced by these very large farms. In terms of farmland owned, however, the split is relatively equal. So when we're talking about designing environmental programs to try to address environmental problems, we need to have a range of tools that are sort of appropriate for all of these kinds of farms, since the spread of the percentage of farmland owned in each category is relatively equal. We want to have policy tools that are sort of appropriate for all of those different kinds of farm operations. This variation in farms leads to variation in program participation. So this first graph shows the percentage of total payments from land retirement programs in each category. And we can see here that it's relatively skewed towards these bottom farms. This is probably to some extent a result of the fact that there are more farms in those smaller categories. But clearly, as I was saying earlier as well, these programs may just be more beneficial for these smaller farms and farms that are prepared to transition out of farming altogether. So as farmers want to spend less and less time on their farm, this is a nice program to be able to get a little bit of payment, maybe have some sort of environmental benefit on the side. Working lands programs, however, are much more heavily used by larger farms, particularly these large family and very large family farms are sort of heavily using these programs. Again, this is probably a result of the fact that they require more management time and effort, and these are the kinds of farms that have that available time to be able to take advantage of those programs. In addition to the national variation in program participation, we also have some geographic differences in participation. So, for instance, this is just a snapshot in time of EQIP application rates in each state. So this would be the percentage of of the farms in each state that are signing up for the program in a given year. And we can see that there's relatively substantial variation, geographic variation. There are some regional trends, but we also have differences between, say, Mississippi and Alabama that are relatively significant. These differences in participation rates are probably mostly the result of differences in those farmer, and community factors. So as those variables, if you will, change between states, so do the participation rates. All right, so now I'd like to shift and look at kind of where conservation programming is going in the future. So we're going to talk about the 2012 Farm Bills and where the conservation title is at for those. By way of an update for those who are not familiar with this process, the Senate has passed a full Farm Bill in late June. The House Committee on Agriculture passed their version of the bill a couple weeks later. However, this bill did not come up for a floor debate or vote. At this point, given the kind of short legislative window between now and the end of the year, it's really unclear whether there's going to be a 2012 Farm Bill or whether we're going to have to wait until next year. However, at this point, the Senate and the House conservation titles are more or less similar. I mean, there are some differences which we'll go through, but primarily the differences between the two bills are in the level of funding. So that kind of allows us to have a good sense of where conservation programming is going to be at here going forward. So what I'd like to do is kind of go through program by program and compare the two bills. Look at similarities first, and then we'll look at some of the differences. So in terms of CRP, both the House and Senate versions have a decrease in acreage. So both of them have a step down from 32 million acres to 25 million acres. There are some very small differences between the two bills and how fast that step down occurs, but the end result is the same. There are also in both bills some changes to the grazing and haying allowances. So whether or not you can, traditionally in the past, when you enroll land in CRP, you're not allowed to do any sort of agricultural production on that land. The new bills would allow some limited kind of use of that land as pasture or hay land. One of the things this does is it makes CRP more accessible for livestock operators. In terms of other land retirement programs, so these would be things like the Wetland Reserve Program. Both bills are taking these existing programs and they're rolling them into one program. It's going to be called the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. This takes three programs, the Wetland Reserve Program, Grassland Reserve Program, and Farmland Protection Program, and puts them into one large program that more or less keeps the goals of those three programs. It's just under one structure. This program includes government nonprofit partnerships. So the idea is that nonprofits, local land trusts can participate in that system by holding those easements. We also have regional conservation programs. So in the past, there have been a number of separate programs that have targeted specific regions. Both bills are looking to consolidate those programs into one program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. This program, the idea behind it is to geographically target conservation dollars at particularly important kind of regional areas. This one relies on partnerships. So the idea is that the federal agencies are going to partner with local groups to achieve environmental goals on a regional scale. The program largely also leverages other programs. So there are reserve funds, or there are funds dedicated in each of some of the other programs like EQIP to help these initiatives. Working lands programs, particularly EQIP, both bills do away with the Wildlife Habitat Incentives Program, which is a small working lands program that's specifically targeted at wildlife habitat. And so it rolls those two programs into one, and then they require sort of a certain amount of funds, 5% or more, of EQIP to be dedicated to wildlife habitat practices. When we talk about differences, I want to talk first about non-funding differences between the programs, and then we'll talk about differences in funding levels. So in EQIP, the House bill returns the maximum payment level, so the maximum sort of incentive payment that farmers could receive goes from $300,000 to $450,000, which is what it was in the 2002 bill. I'll talk a little bit later about kind of what that means for participation. In the Conservation Stewardship Program, both bills reduce the acreage, but the House reduces it by substantially more. We can see here a little over 1 million acres. There are also some differences in conservation compliance. The major difference here is that the Senate requires conservation compliance for crop insurance, to receive crop insurance benefit, while the House does not. One of the other things that's going on in the Farm Bill debate is a shift from direct payments or commodity payments to crop insurance. So more federal money will be spent. More of the benefit to farmers will come from crop insurance than direct payments, as it traditionally has. So what the Senate has wanted to do is make sure that in order for farmers to receive that crop insurance benefit, they have to continue with the conservation compliance that they largely have already been doing. There's a slight difference in program applications between the two bills. The Senate has this little provision that changes the system so that there's one initial application. So currently, when a farmer wants to participate in a program, they have to go and apply for that specific program, whether it's EQIP or CSP or the Wetland Reserve Program. The Senate wants to streamline that process a little bit by just requiring one application. So a farmer would go in and they would say, I'm interested in participating in a conservation program, whether they know what it is or not, and they would just fill out one application, and then the Natural Resources Conservation Service would sort of handle kind of figuring out what the best program to participate would be. The House doesn't have this provision, so it would leave the current application process in place. There are a number of minor programs as well. These are very small, kind of targeted programs. One difference between the bills is that the Senate has a new, what's called a terminal lakes program. This is kind of protecting wetlands or lakes that aren't covered under the current Wetland Reserve Program. These are primarily found out west in kind of the Intermountain West or Desert Southwest. So this program is very, like I said, very targeted, and the House just doesn't include it. In terms of funding, largely the funding levels are the same. If we look at the total, so these numbers represent changes over a 10-year period compared with the current law. So both bills are making fairly substantial cuts to conservation dollars. The Farm Bill in general has seen pretty substantial cuts across the board. So it's not surprising that conservation has taken a cut as well. The major difference here that I think you should pay attention to is the trade-off between the CSP and EQIP. So we see that the Senate bill cuts or maintains the CSP more than the House does, whereas the House has fewer cuts to EQIP. So it's sort of a trade-off between the two bills, between the whole farm approach with CSP and the individual conservation practice approach with EQIP. Okay, so I want to go back now and talk a little bit about how those changes are going to interplay with those program participation factors that we were looking at earlier. So in terms of program payments, there are some minor changes. Mainly, it's this House change to the payment cap, which might allow larger contracts, which, given the limited funds, may result in fewer contracts being issued. So if you have more money going to fewer contracts, it just kind of eats up the available funding for others. One of the things this does is it may skew contracts towards larger livestock operations. When you look at the large funding through EQIP, it's typically going to livestock practices like manure management facilities, which are quite expensive, and so those practices may get more funding if that House limit stays in place. The main thing with program payments, however, is just that there's a significant kind of across the board cut in funding levels. In terms of farm factors, we see this continued shift from retirement to working lands programs. So less money is going to the more traditional land retirement, and more of it's going to programs like EQIP and CSP. Again, given the funding cuts, this is a relative difference. This is going to favor certain kinds of farms over others. So as we were talking about, the working lands programs tend to be favored by those larger, more production-oriented farms, kind of reducing the amount of money available for those smaller, maybe retirement farms or lifestyle-oriented farms. In terms of farmer factors, I think the major thing here is this trade-off between EQIP and CSP. So again, the EQIP program is focused on individual conservation practices as opposed to the CSP, which is really rewarding farmers for going kind of above and beyond, implementing multiple conservation practices and achieving multiple conservation goals. So we have this difference between individual practices and whole farm planning, which may favor certain types of farmers over others. The CSP seems to be more popular among these conservation-oriented farmers, people who are really more oriented or who are more engaged in conservation activities and want to, like I said, go above and beyond. So cuts to that program, so say in the House approach where that program is cut more substantially, then those conservation-oriented farmers may have less availability for participation. In terms of community factors, we do have some significant streamlining. You know, the portfolio is being streamlined. A number of programs have been cut or rolled into these larger combined programs, which probably makes the programs easier to understand. Currently, there are something like 16 conservation programs, and that seems to be kind of a knowledge barrier for farmers to participate. So as programs have gotten more numerous and you have this alphabet soup of acronyms, it becomes really cumbersome for farmers to understand. So just reducing those number of programs probably helps in farmer understanding. We also have changes to the application process that are going to make it easier for farmers to participate. You know, it lowers those transaction barriers, it lowers potentially the amount of time it takes a farmer to sign up for a program. These changes are likely to lead to greater awareness, which may lead to increased participation. As I said earlier, that this change in application process, however, is only in the Senate bill. So if it doesn't move to the House, that benefit probably won't be there. Additionally, we have this increase in this regional approach. The creation of this new regional conservation program sort of shows this increased recognition that there are that these environmental problems often happen on kind of a landscape scale and need these larger community-based approaches. You also have an increase potentially in partnerships or partnership availability. Some of these new programs, like the Regional Conservation Program, really incentivize these kinds of either federal and local government partnerships or federal nonprofit partnerships. One of the benefits of this is that these partnerships really can be very good at tapping into existing social networks, which brings that kind of social norm, social pressure to bear on farmers, or at least lowers, maybe perceptions among farmers that the programs aren't popular or that their neighbors are going to look down on them for participating. And though that can be really powerful in increasing a farmer's willingness to participate. Just to wrap up real quick, I think the key here is that farmers are going to continue to participate, though with the decrease in funding for most of these programs, the opportunities for farmers to participate is going to be lower. With the continued shift in types of conservation programs that are being emphasized, we'll continue to see a shift in the mix of participants. Likely to see more, or relatively more of these larger, more production-oriented farms participating. In addition, the regionalism may lead to more divergent participation and potentially environmental outcomes across the country. So if we think back to that map of EQIP participation rates or application rates. We may see more of that in programs where some states or regions have much more active participation than others. And with that, I'll thank everybody for listening today, and I guess we're gonna have a call to debrief.
Well, thanks, Adam. Yeah, well, let's all get onto this phone number that's in the center of your screen now, and we'll just kind of give him some feedback that way. If I could bring that back, where to go? There it is.